Good afternoon. I'm Dan Scanlon, Chair of the City Property Association, and welcome to the latest of our webinars. A fortnight ago, we were fortunate to hear from the leaders of the City of London Corporation and Westminster City Council on the implications of the pandemic on central London. And today we are joined by a great panel of experts from across the globe to explore how international cities are adapting to the challenges of coronavirus. We will firstly be hearing from my colleague in New York, Callie Haynes. Callie is the Executive Vice President of Asset Management at Brookfield Properties and responsible for oversight of the New York and Boston commercial office portfolio, comprising about 32 million square foot. We will then hear from Laurent Laverne in Paris. Laurent is Global Head of Asset Management and Development at AXA IM, with responsibility for a vast portfolio across all asset classes in Europe, London, the Nordics, Japan, Australia, and the US. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Christian Schiede in Berlin. Christian is Managing Partner of Greenberg Traurig Germany, a leading international law firm. Christian is an expert in German real estate and leads the group across complex M&A transactions in real estate and infrastructure in Europe. They will each be given an opportunity to provide an overview of the current situation in their cities and provide perspectives on the return to the office and any structural trends that they are witnessing. We shall aim to be finished by 2:45, and the opportunity will exist for the audience to ask Q&A through the Zoom platform. So over to you, Callie.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. As Dan mentioned, I'm Callie Haynes. I am located in New York. I oversee our New York and Boston office portfolios. So I'm largely going to be talking about commercial office assets today. As Dan said, it's about 32 million square feet total. That's about 5 million square feet of life sciences in Boston and a little under 27 million square feet of commercial office in New York. That portfolio includes 3 mixed-use campuses as well. So I had to have a lot of experience in touch with hospitality and retail, as well as residential. I've been at Brookfield for about 15 years, so I've kind of seen a lot of growth in the company as we've gone on. In terms of New York, it's obviously very challenging. It's very challenging across the globe and extremely challenging in the city right now. We are looking at the total commercial office market is about 337 million square feet. Across New York, we're looking at about 11.9% vacancy. That's a historical high. It's really a tale of two cities here. For anybody familiar with New York, Midtown and Downtown. Midtown is historically more stable as a commercial office district. And in fact, the pandemic is actually hitting it a little bit harder, we're seeing right now, at least in the early days, versus downtown. So New York has about 247 million square feet of commercial, Midtown is about 247 million square feet. Its vacancy rate right now is at 12.7%. That's the highest since 1995. It's a staggering number for Midtown. Midtown, as I said, is historically very stable. And that is really due to kind of the collision of two things. One, a lot of new development coming online. Two, the pandemic hitting and many tenants putting their, especially on the financial services industry, putting their space on the sublease market. So it's really a collision of those two things that's driving that vacancy up. In downtown, the vacancy is definitely increasing, really largely due to the sublease market as well. However, it seems to be a little bit more stable as it was very well leased and not a lot of new development coming online. That development hit about 3 years ago. So it's actually a little bit more of a stable market. Looking into the future and looking at historical trends and past crises, we do expect Midtown to recover more quickly, although it's been hit harder early. And downtown will follow suit. This is definitely a crisis that will really drive a flight to quality. And I think as Brookfield is probably the top owner operator in the market, this bodes well for us. Tenants are going to be seeking, and I imagine everyone's going to be saying the same thing, tenants are going to be seeking assets that are very well operated, great MEP infiltration systems, Class A, clean, feel safe. That's not going to work well for the Class B and Class C markets. So, the Brookfield's portfolio in particular, we're over 95% leased right now, very stable, high credit-worthy tenants. So we feel pretty good about the future of our portfolio. If we were an operator sitting with Class B and C assets, I think we'd be a lot more challenged. It's really hard to bring those assets up to the quality that tenants are going to want to reside in. So where are we today in terms of, the recovery? June 22nd was the date that all office using, you could go back to the office. Brookfield went back to the office. As you can tell, I'm not in the office right now. My daughter had surgery and I'm taking care of her. And I was actually saying before we got on this that I miss being in the office. It's hard to work from home. My cat's meowing in the background and, but we're slowly coming back, but I'd say it's a lot more slowly than we originally anticipated. And that's for two reasons. One, about 420,000 people fled the city in early March. Not as many of those people have come back as expected. The suburban market is on fire from a residential standpoint. People are moving out of the city and making that a permanent change. That's impacting the office market because as people move out and have learned to work from home, they're just not coming back to the city. So right now, in terms of occupancy, actual occupancy of our office buildings, I'd say we're between 10 and 20%, depending on the asset, but really no more than that. We expect, and what we've heard from tenants, that they will be returning more in full force by year end. Although we are starting to hear that summer of 21 is when many of the larger companies are demanding that their workforce comes back. So it's going to be a long road to recovery from an occupancy standpoint. The problem there is that that is really significantly impacting the city. And the city itself feels deserted, which is tough for New York to feel deserted, but it does. The homeless population has certainly increased, as has, drug use on the streets and violence and crime. So we need people to come back. The biggest hurdle that we're hearing, and it makes sense for people coming back, is public transportation. The city really is very dependent on public transportation. And right now, subway ridership is down 70%. Regional train ridership down 70%. Bus service usage down 60%. City bike usage up about 50%. That's New York's bike sharing program. And foot traffic is up significantly. And tellingly as well, vehicular traffic is basically at pre-pandemic levels. So people are walking, biking, and driving into the city, but they are not using public transportation. And the majority of the workforce depends on public transportation to get into the office. So until there's a comfort level with the usage of public transportation, we're not going to see that big wave of people coming back into the city. And that's really a mental hurdle more than anything else, because there are safe ways to use public transportation, and that messaging needs to become more clear from city officials, frankly. So, touching on a couple of other usage. So retail and dining, obviously very heavily impacted, especially dining. Right now in New York, we still are only allowed to have outdoor dining. It's becoming the end of September. It's getting a little chilly. In a few days, indoor dining will open, but only at 25% capacity. The restaurant industry is so challenged as it is that limited capacity is going to really become a financial burden. So the restaurant industry is going to have a tough future ahead of it. Indoor malls opened a couple weeks ago. And for us in particular, being Brookfield, it's not the area that I work in, but we do own a large amount of malls. So we're seeing an uptick in usage of malls now. But again, people aren't that comfortable coming into indoor spaces like that. And then in terms of residential, we have historically high vacancy, similar to the vacancy rate in Midtown. It's the highest it's been since the 80s. As I said, 420,000 people fled the city, and those are the ones that we know about. Concessions on the residential end are very high, 3 months free for a 12-month deal. I mean, that's amazing. So if anybody wants to move to New York, now's your moment. Definitely a flight to quality there as well. And as I mentioned, the suburban market of New York is on fire from a residential standpoint as people move out of the city or look for second homes. And then, of course, hospitality. Hospitality has been hit hard at its lowest level, 10% occupancy in hotels across the city. Now many hotels in Midtown and then in the Upper West Side have been converted to homeless shelters, which has also been challenging to the neighborhoods within where those hotels reside. So the hotel sector is now at about 30% occupancy, and it's probably going to stay there for a significant period of time as travel is limited. So to recover, I mentioned it's going to be a long road as it is for many cities, but I think for New York in particular, to recover, there has to be that comfort level in public transportation. There has to be a successful reopening of the school systems. I haven't mentioned that yet. The school system is not open. Today is the first day actually for kindergarten through 5th grade in public schools. You know, there's a huge political battle going on between the teachers union and the mayor. So we'll see where all of that lands out. My daughters are still doing remote learning. They hopefully go back next week. But you know, that will allow parents to have the flexibility to come back to work. And then finally, appropriate government messaging. One of the challenges that New York in particular has had is that the mayor of New York and the governor of New York State do not necessarily see eye to eye on many policy initiatives. And they have sort of fought this. Our governor has been applauded for the job that he's done, our mayor not so much. So there's been a battle of wills between the two of them that, you know, that needs to be put aside essentially, and the appropriate messaging that the subways are safe. This is what we're doing to fix this problem. This is how we're solving that problem. That messaging and that positive messaging needs to get out because there is a safe way to return to the office, and Brookfield has proved it. We've been back in the office, as I mentioned, since June 22nd, and everybody has been healthy and safe. And so I think, you know, New York City buckled down and really took the hit hard early and stayed home, did everything we were supposed to do. And now everything has been flat for at least a month and a half. And, you know, now is the time to slowly rebuild. The city always does. It just needs to have that sort of confidence to do so. So that in a nutshell is the state of New York City.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Quite sobering. A lot of parallels with London. I think we're a bit ahead of New York, I would say, on the curve, but a lot of things you're saying will resonate with the audience. Laurent, hopefully you're a little bit more positive. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you. As mentioned, I'm responsible for global portfolio and a variety of asset classes, but I would be focusing on Paris and the office sector. Maybe just as a quick overview, the office market in Paris, or the greater Paris, represents, roughly speaking, 55 million square meters of space. The net addition or the construction, the new starts represent more or less 1 to 1.5 million square meters. So it's a moderate, let's say, 2.5% of additional square meters added to the market. As of Q2 of this year, vacancy rate at the greater Paris region level was around 5.5%. And in the CBD and in the inner Paris area, we're below 3%, and for CBD close to 2%. So I would say from this, let's say, supply side point of view, a relatively healthy market until COVID at least. The Paris area represents, roughly speaking, 6 million employees. Half of it is office employment, so roughly speaking, 3 million. But I would say the fundamentals when we enter into the crisis of the market were healthy. Where we stand currently, we since the end of the lockdown in May, we have returned progressively to the office. There is a relatively diverse answer from employers and companies to the situation, from those who have asked the employees to be back in the office, those who have let the option to the employees to come if they want, and others who have asked the employee to stay at home as long as they can work remotely. So there is not an unanimous, or let's say, a standardized or homogenized way of the return back to the office. We have still a stringent regulation in place in terms of the way back to the office, be it using mask everywhere, basically. You have to wear a mask and you are fined if you don't do it in the street, in the public transport, and unfortunately as well in the office. As you can see, I am a good example. It's not the easiest way to work, but that's a way to try to mitigate the propagation of the virus and to come back to something close to normality. So close, but still far away. It's difficult to give a proper estimate about how many people are really back in the office, what is the occupancy rate within the offices, but it's estimated in the 40 to 50%. Again, quite depending on who are the tenants and what are the instructions they have given to the employees. But I would say as a market overview, that would be probably close to reality. When we look to the way people are coming back to the office, public transport are still obviously necessary in a city like Paris. When we look to the traffic numbers, when at the end of the lockdown, so at the very beginning of the reopening, traffic was about 40% of what it used to be the year before. For September, the expectation are about 60% of people using the transport system, the public transport system versus last year. So it's still well behind, but not necessarily, let's say, I would say in direct correlation to the physical occupancy in the offices. If I take our example, we are back in the office, but we are back on a two-team basis. So we are alterning 1 week in the office, 1 week at home. So basically, we are at 50% at best of our occupancy at any point in time. So that will impact as well the transportation. The way the city have adjusted or tried to adjust in this condition is they have increased quite a lot accessibility for what they call smooth transportation, so pedestrian, bicycles, creating dedicated lines and trying to reduce the car traffic, which has been working quite well until recently. So we have clearly seen a boom in this kind of use of transport. We'll see if it goes through the winter when it starts to be a bit, let's say, more difficult to have or less comfortable to have this kind of use. But I would say it has accelerated a trend which was already there about this kind of new ways of mobility and enabling probably to take a more, let's say, decision in terms of reallocating or redistributing the traffic between the three way of transport: individual car, public transport, and the bicycles. And other type of, let's say, smoother way of smoother mobility vehicles. On the leasing side, we don't see yet a lot of movement, which can be understood. There have been basically no one making big decisions for the time being. A priority of everyone was really about how organize the way back to the office of the staff in a secured and organized way. That said, what we can already perceive is that a trend which was existing, which was flex work and home working was already around. It has been accelerated significantly, obviously, with the crisis, as even companies which were reluctant to consider integrating home working or part of home working into the way they manage their teams, and they've discovered that basically it works. Productivity is still there, even if the employees are not in the office. So that is creating, I think, a lot of thinking in the decision maker for the real estate occupancy of the companies, in terms of what should be their next plan, how it is impacting the way they are using their office space, how it is impacting the volume of office space they need, how it is impacting in this volume the part which is allocated to desks and standard desks and other ways of using the space, because at the end of the day, we need also to have people being happy to be in the office and to be productive. So that is also having some impact in the way they are going to use the office space in the future. So we're expecting to see some changes in the expectation from the office tenant, but that will take a bit of time before materializing very concretely in plans. And I get that it will probably come through in the next 12 to 20 months, when people will have better views on how they are going to use their space, and what will work for them, their employees, their brand, their culture, because all of that is part of it, in fact. For the other sectors, in a nutshell, residential has been very little impacted, maybe a bit more inside Paris, but it's partly related to, I would say, Airbnb flats, which, as much as basically the hospitality, has been deeply impacted by the lockdown and the collapse of international travel. So we have seen some private owners bringing back these flats onto the standard leasing market. But generally speaking, it has been extremely stable. I think also the difference to the US is probably that the level of support of the social system in France particularly is provide quite a lot of benefits. So I think the pain, at least so far, has been more felt by corporates and companies than individuals, which employment and benefit has been completely protected. So residential has been very, very resilient. The part which is really difficult for, especially for a city like Paris, which is attracting a lot of business traveler and tourists, is hospitality. So occupancy rate are extremely low. Still many hotels not opening or not reopening, or not seeing the benefit for them of reopening when they are comparing the expected turnover they will get and the cost of operating the property. So still, I think, long way to go on the hospitality side. Retail is so depending, in fact, on the type of retailer. Footfall are down, but footfall is not necessarily an extremely good indicator today, because where people used to go in family to the shopping centers, now they send only one member to do what they need to purchase. So we see probably a bigger dip in footfall than in turnover. And in turnover, many retailers doing more or less the same, very close to last year turnover. And some sectors suffering more, notably, of course, men and women apparel on one side, and also all what is related to leisure, which is suffering. So dining, restaurant, gaming are doing much less than last year. So these are probably the suffering areas, where they're accumulating both the loss of domestic clients, but as well the international part.
Thanks, Laurent. I'll pass straight over to Christian to give us a view on Berlin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan and the others. I must say, compared to what we just heard, Berlin in particular has been extremely lucky. And I wish that my people here on the ground knew that, how lucky they actually were, especially when it comes to political debates about the next level of measures we are now envisaging. How we managed to cope during the winter half year remains to be seen. The jury is certainly still out, and ironically, as we speak, the Chancellor is meeting with the 16 heads of the federal states and to discuss sort of aligned new measures for the next coming weeks or months. The same happens currently on the Berlin state level, which is basically the city level, because we have seen just very recently over the last 10 days an significant increase in infection rate numbers. However, it is still relatively moderate, to be honest. We have seen over the last 6-8 weeks infection rates from 12 to 14 incidents per 100,000 people during the last 7 days. And that has now, on the Berlin average, now rocketed up to only 26 on average, with the inner city districts scratching at the, or even crossing the critical 50 mark. So it has been pretty stable, and I must say the last 3 or 4 months have been pretty normal. I'm sharing this experience now not only as an advisor to the real estate industry, but also as an occupier, actually, because the lockdown hit me as a tenant in the Brookfield Landmark building, Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, and but we never had a full lockdown. We're probably a little bit unique in terms of resilience, at least as a tenant or a firm. But we always had, even in March and in April, we had like 20%, 25% occupancy on a voluntary basis. But that was certainly not the average in the building. But with the beginning of May, there was generally the call back into the office and back to new normal with the schools and daycare opening step by step. And then we had in June and July the summer break, and in early August we had full return to daycare, full return to school, and honestly more or less full return to the office. So we're currently, knock on wood, have 90% occupancy in our office. This is not the average. Yeah? The average, I'm currently here on business here in Frankfurt, and I've also consulted with some bankers last night. And generally speaking, probably the occupancy rate is 50, 60, sometimes 70%. Here in Frankfurt, it's people think it's probably in the high-rise building it's lower, and the lower buildings it's obviously higher, the occupancy rate, because there's a natural bottleneck, or a threefold bottleneck actually, to returning to the office. And that's one is schools and childcare, the second is public transport, and the third are the elevators. And since in Berlin and also all the other major cities, and we have 5 to 7, depending on how you count, across Germany, including Frankfurt and Munich and Hamburg and Cologne, that's pretty much it's back to new normal. And so that is an interesting comparison, actually, just to give you a little bit of a feeling for the numbers and the characteristics of the Berlin of the Berlin situation. Berlin is the biggest metropole we have in Germany, but it's small compared to London, Paris, not to mention New York, because we only have quote unquote 3.8 million inhabitants, and if you include the suburban belt, it's 4.5 million. So it's compared on a national comparison level, relatively small. Compared to Hamburg, Hamburg is 1.8 million, Frankfurt it's only 760,000, and so on. However, for German standards, we have the longest commute. The average commute is roughly 1 hour. If you compare this with other big cities, this is I think this is time period many people in other bigger cities would be longing for. We have within Germany the lowest level of motorization when it comes to commuting, and we have probably the less high-rise buildings downtown than any other of the bigger cities, in particular Frankfurt, which also makes a difference when it comes to returning to the office, because as I said, one of the three bottlenecks are the elevators or the underground. So if you don't have that level of density, then it's a lot easier. We have how did the government sort of, the government's guidelines generally? Well, we have to wear masks, but not in the office, thank God. We only have to wear masks until now in closed up public rooms, so public transport, planes and trains, doctors' offices, shopping, restaurants, or where the 1.5 meter distance cannot be observed. In schools, it's depends a little bit from federal state to federal state, but in Berlin, for instance, the general rule is you wear masks in the hallways and in the schoolyard, but not during the 8 hours in class. So that's currently sort of the COVID situation for a city like Berlin. And it's pretty similar to other bigger cities, even though you might have noticed that a couple of days ago, Munich used to be for 48 hours a hotspot, crossing the 50 mark, infection number mark, but that was only because of the partying going on in compensation for the Oktoberfest, which is not happening. So in terms of the market trends, current trends in office leasing and office investment market, I would say it is still relatively stable. If you clearly the lease take up has slowed during the last 6 months compared to the year before. But we also see that sort of strategic long-term big projects are continuing. The smaller ones, people are a little bit reluctant, or they were putting their foot on the brake in obviously in March and April and May, but negotiations are now resuming. We have a very low vacancy rate historically. In Berlin, it's only on the office market, it's 1.3%. That means, and there's a lot of new buildings in the pipeline, which offers a moderate level of new deals also. With a high level of pre-lets, or what is coming to the market in 2020, supposed to be having a pre-let ratio of 75%. For next year, it's 50%. On a German-wide level, the average vacancy rates in the big cities is about 3%. So that's relatively stable, still is stable. So there is a general slowdown, but still stable. We don't see slump in rents or depreciation or emergency sales. That's clearly not yet the case. In terms of other asset classes, the current trend is that residential has proven to be very resilient. As opposed to hospitality and retail, there we are facing the similar problems we've just heard, probably not as intensive, but that is certainly where the big repositioning and reshuffling in the next 6 to 9, 12 months will be happening. That's for sure. And generally speaking, because the governments fueled so much money into the system, and we have an expanded or extended furlough scheme until December 2021 even now. Remember, in September next year we have elections, so there was a grand coalition to vote for this extension until after the elections. That is why things have been fairly stable. and that might differ with the beginning of the next year, in particular when the deferral of the obligation to file for insolvency because of over-indebtedness is expiring. So that will be marking some new ground, actually. I probably, with conscious of time, I leave it with that as a sort of report from Berlin.
Great, thanks, Christian. Fascinating insights from you all, and thanks very much. Clearly, you know, there's a divergence of views in each of the cities, obviously driven by some of the demographics. I mean, there's been a lot written in the media around the death of the office, you know, the emergence of a structural shift to obviously agile working, remote working, and potentially a hub and spoke model. You know, where businesses have offices more regionally rather than in city centres. Perhaps as an occupier yourself, Christian, do you want to just comment on your view of the office, the importance of the office, and where you see the trend going?
Yeah, I mean, we have been discussing, obviously, also with our clients, whether it's a 10% or 20% or 30% less need for offices going forward. We don't feel that that strongly, and I think that depends really on what we use the office for. So if the office is a meeting point with clients, with industry representatives, if it's also a platform for creative work solutions and products, that's where you need a platform to build community and to meet. And we have had now 6 months with a lot of home office, and now creativity, utilization, productivity, quality control, onboarding. Yeah, that is simply not possible if you're stuck in your home office. So there will be a future for the office, at least for that sort of quality type of work. There are certainly different types of jobs and different types of offices generally which are easier to replace. But let's face it, you cannot sustainably replace a normal working environment by your kitchen. That's what I don't think. That's why I don't think it will be, the office is dead. It will change a little bit, and certainly in B locations there will be more pressure on rents, etc. But I think the fair guess is probably around the 10% plus or minus, because you also need, there's also this trend that in order to maintain distancing, etc., in a healthy environment, obviously squeezing people into rooms is no longer the solution. So you need to have more space per capita, actually.
Great, and yeah, very helpful. Obviously, completely agree with what you're saying. We talked earlier on the panel about some of the issues preventing return to the office. So we touched on schools, childcare, public transport, tall buildings, elevators, and you know, obviously the impacts of that could be more readily seen in London and New York. Kelly, just in terms of other things that you are seeing and trends in terms of structural shifts, what's your view on what you're seeing?
Huh, that's weird. Never mind. I had unmuted. Sorry. There's certainly going to be a structural shift in how people get to work, and it's not just going to be reliant on public transportation. It's certainly going to be reliant upon city bikes and walking and running. And so I think that some other trends that we're going to see are in the health and wellness. As people use alternative means to get to the office, we need to have sort of the end facilities to accommodate that. So looking at expanding bike rooms, shower facilities, wellness centers within the office assets, in order to accommodate that alternative means. I think that is going to be a trend that's going to continue. You know, just like other crises in the past, 9/11, for example, a lot of things happened really quickly, and then a few of those things stuck. So, for example, turnstiles within office buildings. We didn't have that security measure prior to 9/11. That's now the norm. So I think there are going to be some things that will become the norm, like end-of-trip facilities within office buildings, increased air filtration systems, minimizing the number of people that get into elevators. You know, we're doing a lot of things right now, like having temperature checks in our lobby before you enter. I believe those things will fade away and not become the norm, but it's a measure to make employees and tenants feel safe, and certainly, you know, prevent anybody sick from coming into the building when you have the temperature. I'm curious to hear from the other panelists. Before we go to the office every day, we fill out a little questionnaire on our phone, a little app. It says, how are you feeling? Do you have any symptoms? Have you taken a COVID test recently? And I believe that could become the norm as well to prevent unwell people from coming into the office. But I'd be curious if that's a trend that we're seeing in other cities.
Laurent?
Yeah, I get that will be seen potentially as quite intrusive if it is something where people are forced to do so. So I think it's a lot about personal responsibility, making sure that you're making the right decision. So probably encouraging is one thing. Imposing would be, I think, not very well received when it is inquiries on personal, let's say, situation. So I would not expect that to be generalized, at least in France. There have been debate about tracing people who have been in contact, etc., and that there was a lot of concern about how the data will be used, by whom, how it is stored, for which purpose, etc. So I think it's a pretty sensitive topic.
It's also sensitive topic in Germany, across Germany, but certainly not as emotionally debated than in France, I would assume. That's probably more a cultural thing. But in order to sort of register, quote unquote, whenever you enter a new office or a new building, or even go to a restaurant for dining, that's pretty standard. It's not always observed, but I expect after this afternoon's press conference by the Chancellor, it will be more intensively observed going forward. Because that's the important thing, that you can actually follow the infection chains.
Yeah, and Kelly, we're obviously seeing that in all our hospitality here, where we need to fill in forms, but not necessarily in offices. But you know, that's not to say that it won't come in for the near term. I think again, it's possibly a more of a cyclical issue that will be short term when there is a potential issue like or something else. Mm-hmm. Just following on, I'm conscious of time, but there is probably one last question that I wouldn't mind asking, just in relation to obviously, you know, footfall and the importance of, you know, the major attractions in cities. So, you know, a lot of that is around hospitality, retail, bars, restaurants, art, leisure, etc. And clearly we're going through a period at the moment where they are under huge economic stress. And obviously governments and landlords are trying to support them. Just interested probably to hear from you, Laurent, just in terms of what are you seeing on the ground in France from landlord and government to support the groundscape, and then possibly pass back to Kelly to see what's happening in New York.
So there have been quite a lot of support to, I would say, the broader leisure industry, but also all the most impacted areas of the business. It can be always debated the efficiency of these rules. So there have been, notably, I've seen some rules in Netherlands, which I feel were smarter in terms of public support to typically hospitality or restaurants, where the government is taking a percentage of the payroll, which is in pro rata of the loss of your turnover versus the previous year. While in France, they are taking over the wage of your employees, but assuming that you are putting them or you're not asking them to come to work. So basically, you don't have to pay them, but they are not around. So reopening is a tough decision because you need to make sure that in that case, you have to pay entirely the bill and you need to have the turnover. I think there is financial support. It can be probably better adapted to the situation because that's the reality. Maybe some months ago, we could feel that we're going through this, let's say, incredible lockdown and with zero activity, and all of a sudden, when we're reopening, it will be back to normal. That's not the reality. It's not coming back to normal. It will be slow for many of the businesses, and we need to find the appropriate support to get there. There is an ancillary question which is related to offices, which is about density, going suburban rather than inner cities. I strongly believe that basically we have to keep the choice of density for economic reasons and ecological reasons. We should not forget that part of the problem we're confronted today is coming from the fact that human behavior are now mixing with wildlife, and that was the issue. And if we start to consider that the outcome or the solution is to spread even more humans across the earth in order to keep the distanciation between each of us, I think we can forget about wildlife. So we need to make sure that we're preserving wildlife, that we're keeping space for that. And to do that, we need density. And from an economic point of view, if you have to pay for transportation system, healthcare systems, school systems, you need density. You need density in order to make it an affordable cost to manage all of that. So I think that we'll not see maybe very short term, but in the long run, that's the main solution. So it's for us to adapt our cities and properties in order to manage a proper density and manage probably more flows now than high occupancy.
Yeah, excellent point. Kelly, do you want to just finish with that?
Yeah, sure. So just, obviously New York is really dependent on the tourist industry, like many of the other big cities. And, Broadway is a staple of the city and really adds to the culture. Times Square, although, and all of that attracts a lot of people and requires a lot of density, to Laurent's point. Without Broadway being open, movie theaters being open, the tourist industry basically shut down. The fabric of the city, it feels very, very different. And for that needs to come back for New York City to come back. So we need to come up with solutions. I'm on the board of the Bryant Park Business Improvement District, and they've always opened this beautiful ice rink in Winter Village for the winter. And this is just an anecdote. We decided to all sort of pitch in extra dollars and capital, to Laurent's point, to figure out a way to open that ice rink and do it safely, so that it is something that the city really looks forward to, and it's a symbol of the city during the winter. So to continue some of those traditions to make the city really feel like what it is and what it will be in the future, it just needs a little bit of time to get there. So trying to continue to safely open some of those staples of the city will help boost the culture and bring it back.
Great, and best of luck with that. So thank you all panelists, fantastic, insightful discussion. I think what we've learned is, the office is not dead. There'll probably be a flight to quality. Resi's resilient, and we probably should be living in Berlin at the moment and letting this blow through London and New York through the winter. So thank you all. Thank the audience for attending, and hopefully see you all shortly in person. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.